I'm really excited today to have Jessica Scott-Reid, a Canadian journalist who's written some of the most important stuff, not just in Canada, but around the world on animal rights. And I have so many questions for you. This amazing piece you wrote about humane washing and Vox, how you've been able to get extremely strong animal rights messaging in the most important publications in Canada. But I guess my first question for you is, Jessica, what is wrong with the media? Why, why, why does it seem like one, they report on the most trivial things, like the number of stories I read about the royal family and the Photoshop picture of Kate Middleton is mind blowing. And the number of times they write about the atrocities committed against animals is infinitesimally small. So, you've been a journalist, I think, for your entire adult life, correct?
Yeah, both the last 10 years.
Yeah. And so tell me, what do you think it is about the media that leads them to write about these kind of inane stories and not about stories that involve real suffering?
Well, I think the media writes what will get clicks.
Mm.
Internet age, it's all about readership. It seems to be more about placating and accommodating the reader more so than covering what needs to be covered. I do think there are publications that do that to different degrees, some better than others. But I think it's just a reflection of the audience. And unfortunately, our society today cares more about a lot of these trivial things and want to spend their time reading about them. So it has been a challenge, and it seems to be getting a little bit increasingly more difficult to get these animal rights stories in the media. But I keep on trying, and I seem to keep landing some, and I'll never stop.
Yeah, and I'm really curious about kind of your journey as an activist or animal advocate and journalist and how you became like an animal journalist. But what you said about kind of the media being driven by clicks, that is 100% been my experience, unfortunately. Like the stories that journalists want to talk about are usually the ones that just have some juicy angle to them that
Mhm.
might be completely irrelevant in many ways to the substantive animal rights story. So, we did an investigation of the president's turkey farm. Just the fact that it was the president's turkey farm made it incredibly fascinating, even though it just involved like literally two turkeys. There's so many other turkey farms that are exploiting just as many turkeys and as even more horrific ways in some cases. But the fact that it was applying to the president was the thing that got the clicks. But the other thing is, there's a study. So in my former life, I was an economics PhD student, and there was a study done by this guy. He used to be at Stanford, now he's at Harvard. Called his name's Matt Genskow, and he did this study of media slant, trying to understand, is the media kind of driving public opinion or being driven by public opinion? And his
Mhm.
conclusion was very much the latter, that the media is kind of giving people what they want.
Mhm.
And that makes me kind of sad though, because it means that's like almost a harder problem to solve. Because if the public doesn't want to see these things and doesn't want to read these articles, I mean, what the heck do we do about it? It's
Yeah,
like
but you
it's
can utilize this. I work within the space, so you have to learn how to work with that. And I think there
Mhm.
are ways, and I know some animal rights and animal advocacy organizations are really good at it. Like you talk about the president's turkey farm, you utilize whatever sort of in you have. And I always tell people who approach me with stories, I need to have an in to be able to bring this, especially to an opinion section of a newspaper. I have to have something novel, something timely. But when we do, it really works. And it can be really helpful. Once you have that, your foot in the door, I often say, then I can go into the story and add those sort of evergreen, horrific points that we need to talk about, animal protection issues. Um, but we need that in. And so if you can have the skill to find it, you can use it in your favor.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that unfortunately, so many animal rights activists are one, inexperienced with the media, and second, we are kind of stuck in our echo chamber to some extent.
Mhm.
So it's hard for us to see what are those ends, and it's a skill that we need to develop. And I mean, honestly, reading journalists like you is one of the ways I've learned what those ends are. So I'm just
Oh,
thank you
that's
for the
great to
work you've
hear.
done.
It is sort of something I've had to really figure out along the way is how to kind of balance between these two worlds in a
Yeah,
way where they both work.
yeah. So how did you get started as a journalist? Like, what made you decide you wanted to do this?
I wasn't really seeking to be a journalist. I had a background in communications, so I wanted to work more in advertising or public relations initially. And then I did a master's degree in cultural studies, and I was living abroad in Europe. And I started writing about culture and food. I wasn't yet vegan, but I was really drawn. I was living in Switzerland at the time. I was really drawn to the whole eat local movement and then the organic movement. So much of the food served in Switzerland literally comes from, if you're sitting at a restaurant, you'll be able to see the fields, the vineyards,
Mhm.
the animals in which these things come from. And that really fascinated me. So I started writing about food and then into more ethical food options. And personally, I was trying to do the same thing, is eat ethically. And the extent to which I was going to figure out ways to do that, I think you hear so many people who are vegan who started this way where, I drive for hours to find an ethical farm where I could meet the animals and then somehow feel good about buying meat from this farmer or eggs from this farmer. And as you keep doing that, you realize this is stupid. And
Mhm.
so I'm writing and living simultaneously this journey of figuring out how to eat more ethically. And eventually, once I had my daughter, just over 7 years ago, I had to really come to terms with my own values. And that was that
Mhm.
I couldn't serve her animals. She was a 6 month old baby who loved animals, and I couldn't put animals
Mhm.
down in front of her to eat. And so my work and my personal life progressed towards veganism. And once I started writing from a vegan perspective, um, everything changed, everything opened up, everything became more clear. I was able to write even about companion animal issues or circuses or fashion issues just so much clearer once I
Mhm.
had that sort of vegan perspective on things without trying to find this welfare middle ground. And it really took off from there, and it turned into my whole job, which is so wonderful.
Yeah, so you said two things that are really interesting to me. One is, well, more than two things, but two things that I wanted to comment on. One is the fact that having your daughter is what caused the transition. Because sorry to the antinatalists out there, but I actually think that vegan families are really important to the future for a variety of reasons, and I'd love to dive more into that because I want to understand more about how that caused some transition for you. But the second thing, and let's put a pin on that because I want to ask you more
Yep.
about that. My friend Carter's going to be super pissed because he runs this anti-natalist organization. He's a great
I know
guy.
a few
And
like that.
he's,
Yeah.
okay, do you know Carter Dillard?
I know, but I know a lot of
Okay, you
people
know
who are
people
in
like
the vegan
that.
movement who have this sentiment about not
Oh,
bringing
for
kids to the
sure.
world, and I
No,
get it. I only have one, so I feel like I'm
yeah,
okay.
exactly. If you have
Yeah,
one, you're actually depleting the human population,
that's
right?
right.
It's going to
Perfect.
decrease. No, but I'm also really good friends with Alexandra Paul, the former Baywatch actor. She was actually my client, and I love her to death. Sadly, I'm not allowed to talk to her anymore because I've been banned from contacting all my quote unquote co-conspirators. But she's super kind of concerned about human overpopulation, and I can
Mm.
tell every time I talk about like the fact that I might want to have kids someday. There's like a part of her who dies a little bit. I can see it in her face. She's like, it looks like she's melting away. She loses a little bit of faith in me and the world. But I think there's a good argument for vegan families, which I'll ask you about in a second. But the other thing you said is about the the weird kind of almost walking on stilts that we have to stand on and we have to balance before you adopt kind of the more animal rights vegan perspective. And it reminds me a lot of just I don't know if you heard about this theory of epicycles in science and Thomas Kuhn's work on this. So Thomas Kuhn is the most famous philosopher of science.
Hmm.
He wrote this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions to try and understand why is it that people get caught up in these weird fallacies. And he points to like, Galileo and the thousands of years where human beings were convinced that the earth was at the center of the universe and the sun revolved around it. Um, and he comes up with this theory of epicycles, which is, you know, one of the bizarre things about those days when we thought the Earth was the center of the universe is when you looked at kind of the rotation of all the celestial objects, the stars, the moons, the sun, it didn't make any sense. Because if the Earth was at the center of the universe, you'd expect everything to kind of go around in a normal circle. But what you find is all these weird epicycles, like these circles within circles, like you'd see this star or moon or planet that would turn a little bit and then it would turn a little bit more, like as if it had a circle within a circle. And it didn't make any sense. And so what scientists did, instead of just coming up with what was the correct theory, which is, well, we're wrong. The Earth is not at the center of the universe. They came up with these epicycles. They said, well, yeah, the Earth is still at the center of the universe, but there's these little epicycles, these circles within the circles that you have these planets spinning around us. And over time, the entire structure collapsed. And you have like Copernicus and Galileo just coming forward and saying, no, this is all nonsense. And I feel the same way about animal rights. There are all these like weird epicycles, these weird contrived explanations. So like in my court case in Sonoma County, the judge literally compared animals to cellular matter. She said, well, if we start defending animals, does that mean we have to start defending cellular matter too? So obviously we can't defend animals. And it's completely absurd. It's an epicycle. But you're absolutely right that to the extent you try and kind of justify the current system or even modify it in small ways and don't realize we just need a fundamentally different way of thinking about this problem.
Yeah.
Stop thinking about animals as commodities for us to use, and suddenly it all makes sense. We don't have to try and, have and, like just hem and haw about how, it's probably better to suffocate animals to death than to slit their throats. It's probably better to have them live in cage-free environments where they're cannibalizing each other rather than stuffing them in a cage. You can just say, regardless of what you think about any particular welfare improvement, the fundamental problem is we are treating animals as if they are things. And as you said about your daughter, most children understand there is a difference between a dog and a piece of garbage. But the problem is I feel like there's so few journalists who are willing to step out of that framework. I mean, I just listened to this podcast of Ezra Klein, for example, a very famous New York Times columnist, and he's vegan. He's a great guy. I've talked to him. I love him. I think he's incredibly inspiring in so many ways, but he's just so scared to step out of this very, very narrow animal welfare mindset to like a more revolutionary, but also correct paradigm where we see animals as beings who just have rights. So I guess, have you had any success trying to get journalists to follow in your footsteps and start thinking about this from like the vegan or animal rights perspective?
I think since the climate change conversation has come in, that has been helpful. So we've seen an increase of journalists, reporters on the climate change beat, for example. And that has allowed more inroads for journalists to consider animal agriculture. It's still a work in progress, obviously. It's something a lot of us in this space are working on constantly, is getting environmental reporters to care more about the connection to animal agriculture. But when it comes to actual animal rights perspective, animal liberation, vegan perspectives, I'm kind of an island. I love working with, for example, Sentient Media. Sentient. I kind of split my time between working half here in Canada as an island, as an independent journalist, and then half my time with Sentient more in the U.S. So there is hope. There are young journalists coming up who are often coming from the environmental background, who are learning about the connection with animal agriculture. And for a lot of people, whatever inroad there is, then you start learning about the truth about factory farming, about industrial style slaughter. Even if it's health that brings you in, or environmentalism that brings you in, once you get to the spot where you actually see, hear, smell the truth, then we're going to have, I think, a lot more journalists willing to talk from this perspective.
Yeah. There's this interesting concept in sociology called tempered radicalism, where when you're trying to bring in a radical idea, you bring it in through something that seems more normal.
Exactly.
And the example given by the psychologist Adam Grant in his great book called Originals is, so women's suffrage activists back in the late 1800s or late 1700s, early 1800s, they had this very radical vision that women should have rights. It's not very radical today, but back then when, women couldn't testify, they couldn't own property, there were no laws against domestic violence. There's no such thing as rape if it was done against your own domestic partner, which is terrifying. It's just unbelievable that there was an era in human history when we thought this way about women. But back then it was considered very radical to say things like, well, women should have, the same rights on the job, or should get the same right to education that men have. To the point that, very famous philosophers like Thomas Taylor at Cambridge, he mocked women's rights by comparing it to animal rights, by saying, what's next? You give animals rights too? But one of the ways they overcame these obstacles, the opposition, new ideas, was they framed women's rights in terms of values and paradigms that people already kind of supported and agreed with. And so one of the most important framings, apparently, in getting women's suffrage across the finish line in the United States was combining it with temperance activism. So there were a lot of, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States. The late 1700s is 100 years before it actually happened. But in the late 1800s, Susan B. Anthony and a bunch of other activists, instead of just exclusively saying women deserve rights, give us equal rights, they actually made this weird argument that, in retrospect, it was genius, but like I would not have thought about it. But I guess temperance and domestic tranquility was a really important cause in the early 20th century because there were all these people concerned about alcohol, and like prohibition banned alcohol in the United States. And so one of the arguments they made is we have too many drunk men who are out of control, and giving women the vote will allow us to fight for temperance more effectively, because these households with drunk men who are out of control and just, basically pass out. I was going to say on their couch. I don't know if they had couches in the early 19th century, but just passed out all day. We need someone to represent that family. And when the drunk guy is totally out of commission, we need, as an ally for the temperance movement, to advocate for families and domestic tranquility. We need to give women the right to vote. And that was actually one of the coalitions that formed in the late 20th century that got suffrage across the finish line. So I'm with you there. So one other just little story I have to tell. So I've never been on your side. I've always been on kind of the advocacy side, not on the journalism side, but I have worked with a lot of journalists over the years, including some very important publications. And I had a journalist, I don't want to say his name because I don't want to call him out, at the Washington Post, who I worked with on multiple stories. Great guy, he was really supportive and thought these questions were really important, and always wrote great pieces, just truthful, deeply investigated pieces. But one of the things he told me one time when I was pitching him was, and he actually turned me down on a story, and I don't even remember what story it was. I'd have to go back through history to figure out which of our investigation was. But he told me the average decision maker at one of these elite media publications, or even a non-elite media publication, is an old white guy who loves bacon.
Yep.
And when you're pitching your story, you kind of have to think about what is an old white guy who eats bacon a lot going to want to read. And I was like, that is not what I thought at all.
That's absolutely the truth. It is. You have to think, and it's sometimes.
But even at the Washington Post, you think at the Washington Post is like a liberal publication of a lot of youthful energy. But he said, no, all the decision makers here are old white guys who love bacon. And I'm just being honest with you. Don't give me this radical shit. Tell me why your radical shit can be clothed in a way that the old white guy who loves bacon is going to want to read it.
That's exactly right, and that's where the article.
Oh, that's so sad, though.
You know what? I'll give you the tip that I give to other up and comers or even activists who are trying to get their voice in the media organizations. The opinion section is gold. I love working in the opinion section because they need opposing opinions. So you fill that space, and I'll often pitch to national publications here in Canada as just exactly that. Do you need to fill some space? And I'll often joke, like, it's sad that that's what animals are given, is that that space that suddenly needs to be filled that isn't filled. But I have editors who know that I can come up with 500, 700 words tomorrow about some kind of animal issue in the media, and they're thankful to be able to throw something in there to fill some space. And I'm like, we'll take it. And they're happy to have those radical opinions in that section.
In the opinion section, yeah.
Need it there.
Yeah, and you've placed some amazing stuff, like about the ag laws, about Jen McQueen's, case many years ago. So I mean, how do you actually do a pitch? Can you just describe them, like whether it's opinion, and you do both, like you're pitching, freelance news pieces and investigative pieces, like your piece in Humane Washing and Vox, which I want to talk about too, is just amazing. Just like the best thing that's been written about humane washing. I've said this to many people.
That was definitely a group effort. That was me and Kenny at Vox. He did so much of the work on that too, which is great. Yeah. So it was more of a team effort on that one, because that was my first piece. I'm actually working on another one with them right now that I can't talk about quite yet, but it'll be very
shit.
Yeah.
Oh, can you give us a hint, please? I want to know.
I don't know how much I can say, but let's just say it's a space within the animal agriculture world that has not had a whole lot of coverage, and we got a lot of coverage.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's going to be exciting. I mean, it's hard. It's a difficult thing to write about, but it's going to be important. But Vox, the Future for Perfect Space, they allow me to do reporting, as Sentient does as well. They allow me to do reporting in this space. Whereas in the mainstream media in Canada, sort of once you are an opinion writer, you're not really as allowed to be a reporter. Sometimes I'll report in the lifestyle section on, for example, faux for fashion designers, or in my local paper about local vegan restaurants, things that were my obvious bias is okay, because once you're identified in the media as an animal advocate, which is what I put in my bio, I can't go write about the hog industry as a reporter, but I can write about vegan fashion.
Interesting.
So yeah, I utilize whatever channels I can, and I kind of know where I can do certain things, and where I can't.
How did you get started doing this? And actually, before you answer that question, that's actually kind of disappointing to me, because I don't know what your theory of what good journalism is, but my theory of good journalism is not that you pretend to be completely objective, but you just tell people what your biases are or what your opinions are. Like I'm
It's
with Glenn Greenwald in this. I mean, Glenn's an
yeah,
extremely controversial figure, and he's won a Pulitzer Prize, but he's hated by a lot of people on both the right and the left in the United States. But his view is, look, everybody's got biases. I just tell you what mine are. Or
yes,
not even biases. Everyone's got opinions. I
for
just tell you what my
expertise,
opinions are so you can
but
assess.
expertise.
Yeah. So and I think American journalism, I mean, I've seen so much really good, deep reporting by journalists who do say, I have an opinion about this too. And I think
Yeah.
that's valuable. I
It's
mean,
changing. It's changing. I think it's shifting. I think in the last particularly 5 years, I'd say even since the Black Lives Matter movement was blowing up, that we've seen more activist journalists. That's even
mhm,
allowed. That would have been considered an oxymoron a decade ago, and
yeah.
now it's even with environmental reporters too. You have environmental reporters that come from this area of expertise. So I
Mhm,
consider myself just an somewhat expert in this field. So if there's something to write about the hog industry, why wouldn't I be the person to write about it? It's
sure.
because I come from a perspective of centering the animals,
Mhm,
that causes the problem. So I have also taken it upon myself to sort of, outside of my own work, try to push the media here in Canada as much as I can to not only consider the industry as a source. If you see a story about barn fires, for example, they will often talk to not just the farmer who's devastated, who lost all of his property, but then they will talk to, say, a lobby group, dairy farmers of whatever, and they'll talk to them about how this impacts the industry, or the market. And I'm like, you need to talk to an animal advocacy organization too.
yeah.
If this was a story about children, for example, that were the vulnerable beings at the center of this story, you wouldn't just talk to industry. You would talk to a children's advocate to get the
Mhm.
perspective, or a children's psychologist to get the perspective on how the child could be coping with this situation, or how the child is suffering in this situation. So when we have animals as the vulnerable beings at the centers of stories, we should not be talking around them. We should be including voices of activists and advocates who are the ones speaking for those who can't speak in the media. That seems
Yeah.
like balanced journalism for me.
Yeah, when I was, I think it was right after I was acquitted in Utah, or maybe it was right before. It's so weird. This is all blurred because I've had so many trials and so many convictions and acquittals. I don't even remember which one's which. But I think it was right before, or right after I was acquitted in the Utah Smithfield trial. There was a huge barn fire at an egg farm where I don't remember exactly how many, but it was hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of animals burned to death alive. Just horrible suffering. And imagine just these creatures in terror with the smoke filling their barns, in cages, unable to escape, just
Mm-hmm.
the heat increasing, the fire getting closer, and they can't even run away because they're trapped in this cage. Just
Horrific.
the experience of these poor creatures who just have the feelings that a dog or cat has. And I kid you not, there was so much reporting on this barn fire. And I think every single article said no one was hurt.
Yeah, so typical.
No one was hurt.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of living creatures shrieking in agony, burning to death, trapped in cages as they clamor in terror to try and escape. And every single one of these journalists said no one was hurt. I dare you to look at one of these
Yeah.
birds. And none of them did. None of the journalists ever even visited the site. Because I remember we actually visited the site. And we're like, wait, all these people are writing about this. And they're just taking like the stock footage that everyone else has used. No one's, and the farmers obviously didn't allow anyone on the site. So you could only see it from the road. But we were looking at the road and we could still see the smoke emanating from this barn. And you have all these journalists saying over and over again, no one was hurt. And it was just mind blowing to me.
And headlines will talk about how much money was lost.
Exactly.
They won't even talk about like
Yeah.
the individuals lost. They'll talk about, sometimes I've even seen weight the
Yeah.
weight of the animals that were lost, like
Yeah.
how many
How many
pounds
tons
of
of animals are, yeah,
meat.
no, I've
Yeah,
seen that too. Yeah, as if the only thing that matters is just kind of the biomass of these
right.
individual living beings who suffered so profoundly. And not just the fire, but even the months and years beforehand, if they're trapped in an egg farm. Yeah, there's something just incredibly bizarre and just counterfactual. And it's particularly bizarre to me that they say to you, "Oh, you can't cover this because you have an opinion about this." Because if you look at other episodes of suffering or violence, if someone's covering an atrocity like the war in Ukraine, and they have an opinion about whether Russia should be invading Ukraine, if someone's even covering Gaza, and they have an opinion about whether the Israeli government should be bombing civilians in Gaza, no one would say like, "Oh, therefore you can't write about this." It's like, no, I mean, the people. I mean, I'm fully supportive of the idea that you should have people on both opinions writing about things.
Well,
Let's definitely listen to
they do let
countervailing
me write about
perspectives.
it. They let me write about it, just not report. So
Right?
that's where
Yeah.
the opinion section comes in, or analysis
Yeah.
comes in, and I'm grateful for that. So if like a barn fire happens, and I see that they have covered it in the news and they've talked about it in the way that you describe, that's when I jump into the opinion
And
section,
say, yeah,
pull that out, and then
yeah,
talk so much about exactly how you just spoke, describing the agony the animals endure. I use it as an opportunity. So I
yeah,
found a way to hack the system a little bit.
yeah. So tell us, how did you first start pitching? Because you're working in advertising. You do this master, in, I think you said cultural studies. And how do you become someone who's able to place things in the Globe and Mail, which is, for the Americans who don't know, shame on you. What's wrong with you? All these Americans who don't know anything about the world. But the Globe and Mail, I think, is among probably the most important publication in Canada.
Yeah,
So
I'd say it's the top paper. So the
okay,
Globe and Mail,
so
Toronto Star, my two go-tos. And you know what?
yeah,
I started writing about dogs and
really
zoos and welfare
interesting.
issues even before I was vegan.
But how did you even start? Like, what is the process? If someone's sitting there thinking, "Man, how do I start writing?" Because one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is I feel like there's a huge deficiency in great written content on animals. There just isn't a lot out there, and you're one of the few who's not only been able to produce it, but get it out there in really important publications. So how does that journey even begin? I mean, what was the first pitch about animals you made, and how did you
Yeah,
succeed?
I began first writing for smaller publications. So I was
Mm,
blogging. I was living in Europe at the time, so I was blogging for different sort of English speaking publications that wanted to hear about the life of expats. And at first, my big
mm.
break was the Wall Street Journal, which worked out
Really?
really well. They used to have an expat blog. And so, because I was living in Switzerland and Germany at the time, and I was an English writer working on a master's degree in cultural studies, it allowed me that in. And I remember writing about um, I was living in Russia at the time, actually in Moscow, and I wasn't yet vegan, but I was really taking notice of how animals were treated in Moscow, how
Mm.
the position they had in the culture. I remember going to a restaurant where they had a fake barnyard scene behind glass, and they had actual live animals while you were sitting and eating, including a whole cow
Whoa.
in the middle of a restaurant. So
Damn.
that, on top of street dogs, also people giving pony rides outside of bars in the middle of the night. It was just a really big change from my time living in Canada and Germany and Switzerland. And so I wrote for the Wall
Wait,
Street
wait,
Journal.
wait. I got to ask you about this restaurant. You went to a restaurant where they had farm animals in
Yeah,
the restaurant
they
walking
were
around,
behind
like as
glass.
an exhibition?
Yeah, like it was a novelty. It was a gimmick. It was so that while you're sitting and dining in this fine dining restaurant, they had this sort of giant aquarium style room with not just farm animals but peacocks, bunnies, goats, and it was a small room. I'll send you the
Wow.
article afterwards. And a cow that just laid there while people are eating meat
Beef.
around this cow.
Wow.
And it really jarred me into thinking that this is so normal here. And I remember writing the piece for the Wall Street Journal, this is over 10 years ago, about how to cope with moral dilemmas in cross-cultural situations.
Hmm.
And that's really what started me writing about animals and thinking more about them. And I remember one day, after writing for different sort of small lifestyle publications, different magazines about food and ethical food, and going through that process, and I said to myself one day, I just want to write about animals. That's all I want to write
Hmm.
about. I just want to
Yeah.
quit everything else and write about animals. And that's when I started writing about animal rescue, like dog rescue, which I was involved in. And my very first piece for the Globe and Mail, I believe, was about dog rescues in Canada being overwhelmed and unregulated. And my experience as someone who fostered dogs, and seeing how difficult of a task it is to run these rescue groups with no rules. And because I had a unique perspective, a firsthand perspective as someone who was involved in it, they gave me a shot. And once you get one in, you can keep that going as long as I had a really great editor who was there at the time, Amberly. She gave me a shot. We've become friends since. And once you find that one editor or those two editors, I have another one at the Toronto Star, Scott, who's also just gives me a chance over and over and over again. And they trust me to tell these stories in ways that are not going to scare off mainstream readers, that I somehow balance that line between, I always say, clever, not crazy, to sandwich in all of the needed facts about piglet thumping and chick maceration. I get it in there as often as I can to show people, but it's all couched in very easy stuff to read so that editors don't get scared and readers don't get scared.
So how did you develop those relationships? I agree those relationships are really important. I've had a relationship with a journalist at the New York Times for many years, and part of what's allowed for him to report on this successfully is just the fact that I think we like each other. And I wouldn't say we're friends. I haven't done as well as you have in becoming friends with some of the key people, but we're friendly. And so I'm just wondering, like, what is your approach to trying to develop that relationship?
I think knowing when not to bug editors. I think I've over the years honed an ability to bring them ideas that they're very likely going to say yes to, and not inundating them with ones that I think they won't. So I'm not just shooting my shot all the time. I'm very selective because if you bug them too much, they're going to be annoyed. So you have to make it worthwhile. So I work really hard to try and get things that are timely, that are in the news, quick pitches, because they're busy people. In the media space, people are getting laid off all the time. Editors are being inundated with more and more tasks. So the easier I make it for them, sending them copy that doesn't need a whole lot of work, all of that is all helpful. And then they like you.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's interesting. That's a point that one of the world's most famous organizers and activists uses. So there's this guy named Marshall Gantz at Harvard. But he used to organize with the farm workers movement. He was a civil rights activist in the 1960s. And then he was like one of Cesar Chavez's lead organizers, organizing farm workers in California. And they took on a big agricultural industry, basically no power, no money, and they won. I mean, they unionized the farm workers, an unbelievable victory. And one of the things he says over and over again in his trainings, in his documents, is you have to make every ask an opportunity. Think about the value you're providing to the person you're making a request of. And that's kind of what you did with these editors.
Exactly.
Just like figured out, okay, what is my value proposition to you? And I think that's so important because I feel like there was a time where it kind of worked to just shotgun style shoot press releases to everybody and just hope someone picks it up.
It did.
I just think that just doesn't work anymore at all.
Yeah.
Like I still even remember around the time, because I've been doing press stuff. Like I first started doing press stuff when we tried to ban foie gras in Chicago 20 years ago. And I remember there was a time where you could just throw out press releases out. And especially when email was kind of new and, like everyone on this listening is like, email new, what the hell are you talking about? But I remember a time when we didn't have email, it just wasn't even a thing.
Well, and so back in those days, a couple emails a day and now they're getting
now they're getting bombarded. I mean, I even get bombarded. I'm like nothing. No one gives a shit about it. I get bombarded with all these press releases. So I had a podcast that I ended. So we're renewing the podcast because I'm no longer facing as many charges. So I now have time to do things like have conversations with wonderful people like you. But we shut down the podcast about 1.5 years ago because I was facing so many felonies that I didn't have time. And I still got pitches from all these PR firms to come on my podcast. I'm like, dude, do you even realize I don't have a podcast?
Yeah.
You're pitching me on something that I don't have. And it made me realize, like, okay, you really have to be thoughtful. And now whenever I pitch to a journalist, I look at their Twitter feed. I look at the stories they've written. I always, like, the advice I give to activists when they're making a press release is, even in your subject line, like literally your subject line should be a subject line that's similar to the headlines of the articles they've written. Yes. You should be able to see that subject line and think, oh, that's like something I could have written. And if you can't say that, then don't send the email to this person. Send it to somebody else.
We're selfish,
So
right? People are selfish.
yeah,
if you appease somebody for something they've done in the past, I mean, it definitely gets my attention when somebody writes me, says, "Hey, Jessica, I really loved your article on this,
yep,
this, this, and this. This is something that we think would be similar to that." That gets my
yep.
attention more than a blanket PR
No,
pitch.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I mean, and the good thing is, I really do think there is space for this. I mean, I think you're right, especially the more corporate media outlets are completely driven by clicks and advertising because that's their model. I mean, they just need more clicks to make more money. And I even get why they do that because they can't pay the bills if no one clicks. But I think there's a space that can be developed
Yep.
that's even just an animal rights space. And I think about like the most successful story we ever did was again with Glenn Greenwald, this guy who's a Pulitzer Prize winner,
Yep.
most famous for doing the Edward Snowden story, where he exposed the U.S. government was spying on all of our citizens without search warrants or legal authorization, violating the law, and then we kicked the guy, exposed it out of the country. Now he's hiding in Russia, and I think it's one of the great scandals in American history that we don't talk about enough. That this guy exposed mass law-breaking activity by our own government, and he was the one who had to flee. But Glenn Greenwald wrote this story with us about that same pig farm in Utah where he rescued some piglets. And it was shared on Facebook alone, not even accounting for Twitter and all the other social media platforms. And this is back in the day where Facebook mattered.
Yeah.
Facebook seems to have died now, but
Yeah.
back in 2017, Facebook still mattered. It was shared on Facebook alone 130,000 times.
Wow.
Glenn told me that I think it was the most read article he had ever written. But it was because it wasn't just an animal rights story. It was a story at the intersection of another issue that a lot of citizens care about, which is government overreach and government corruption on behalf of corporations. A lot of people are increasingly distrustful of government, and I agree with them. I think we should be distrustful of government. And even like your piece about the Ag Act laws is very similar, that we can't trust the government to manage our speech because the government doesn't necessarily have the interest of our community and the most fundamental values. And thank God the Ag law in Canada was struck down because it is an animal issue first and foremost, but it's also an issue that even if you don't care about animals yet, you should be concerned about if you care about things like corruption and free speech, right?
Yeah, we talk about this often in at Sentient as well. And just something that I'm doing a lot more of in general is talking a lot about misinformation, disinformation, a lot of debunking. And a lot of it has to do with issues like, say, labeling laws, or anything that is oppressing people and their choices. And anytime you're being fooled, not just by government, but by industry too. So we do a lot of, deep dives on marketing bullshit, so to speak. And I know a lot of people, mainstream readers, who might not care about animal issues, like you said, but they hate being fooled. They hate being taken. And I think that's another great inroad to get people just looking at the animal agriculture industry with new eyes, is to say, I know here in Canada, we just had an investigation from Animal Justice, an incredible animal law organization, into Burnbrae Farms, which is a very popular egg supplier, that they're talking about nest-laid eggs. That's on their carton, nest-laid eggs. And then they go in and show what these nests look like. And of course, it has nothing resembling what any kind of person would think a nest looks like. And especially not the picture of the nest on the carton.
On the marketing. Yeah.
And so when you expose these marketing fallacies to mainstream people, they're going to be pissed about that. Whether or not they care about animals, they do not want to be lied to, and they may make different buying decisions once they realize that they're being taken, especially because they're paying more for these premium products.
Yeah. No, one of the beautiful things about the humane washing angle is first that it is attractive even to people who are not vegan or animal rights activists yet, because who likes being lied to? Who doesn't want to hear about it when you're being lied to? You kind of want to know.
Right.
If someone just comes to, like, I'm in an office right now, if one of my team members came by and said, like, hey, I just want you to know you've been lied to, and then they walked off, I'd be like, wait, what do you mean?
Exactly.
Who lied to me? What did they say? I want to know the truth. It's almost irresistible. You want to hear more. If they came to me and said, like, hey, by the way, I just want to say you're a shitty podcast, I don't like listening to what you have to say, I'd be like, hey, I don't want to talk to you. Get away from me.
Yeah,
But if you say I've been lied to. But the other thing is about that that line framework, the humane washing, and we'll define humane washing for the audience in a second, because I want to ask you about your Vox piece. This is a great segue into that piece you did in Vox. Is it kind of leads people down the animal rights path?
Yeah.
Because when you see not just the specific factual lies, right? The fact that this company is saying, oh, these animals have a wonderful nest, or they're free range, or they're cage free, and you think they're running around in fields and playing with little kids. Like that literally was one of the marketing ploys that this Whole Foods egg farm used. They have in their packaging one chicken playing with a little girl in a grassy field. And you think, oh my God, it's such a wonderful, humane, cage-free facility. I didn't realize it's a huge factory farm. But it's not just the specific factual lies. The deeper you dive, and this is why your piece in Vox is so important, into the system as a whole, it shows the entire system is just broken, that there is no way to treat animals humanely in this system. When, like one of the most damning details you revealed in your Vox piece was, I think it was like half of the labels being approved by the USDA in the United States basically have no evidence behind them at all. The company's just slapping some label on and saying, hey, we're free range and our chickens play with little girls. And it's like, what's your evidence for that?
Right.
We just said it. That's it. So tell us about this deep dive you did in humane washing. Maybe we could start by just defining what is humane washing.
So humane washing, I believe the terminology was born first out of what we've heard about greenwashing, right? So greenwashing is when companies or products are being presented as being somehow eco-friendly, but it's often not the case. And so humane washing is very much the same. When we see products like, say, cage-free eggs or free-run this or grass-fed this, ways to make it sound like animals are living humanely, without usually any talk about slaughter, of course. And so you'll see these on labels on products, or perhaps in marketing, online or on television, to make it appear as though these animals are being treated somehow above the regular standard. And so when I was writing the piece and I was speaking with Dina Jones at the Animal Welfare Institute, she made it very clear that one of the most important things to differentiate is that very little is being done above the baseline as it is. And interestingly, I just published a piece with Sentient where I revisited these concepts, because we were looking at humane washing within the pet food industry, which is a new evolution. So the Vox piece was written, I think, 2 years ago, and it's just kind of gotten worse. So now if you go to the pet food store, companion animals store, you see down these aisles, these free-run, free-range, grass-fed, humanely raised, ethically sourced pet foods. So we looked at a brand called Open Farm, which is thought to be the best of the best because it's certified humane, and looked into what any of that means. And once again, just like with the Vox piece, we start going down what this terminology means, and it means very little, almost nothing above the basic standards for care, and certainly the basic standards for slaughter.
Oh my God. You just kind of blew my mind. I buy Open Farm dog food. Plant-based. I buy their plant-based food.
For a sec. Yeah,
but that makes me feel horrible because I've been supporting this company. I had no idea.
I didn't even know that they made a plant-based dog food, to be honest. Their marketing is so geared towards, dogs are carnivores, dogs need meat. There's so much about that. I'm glad they make a plant-based food. Keep buying it.
Yeah, they do have one. I'm looking it up right now to make sure it is Open Farm, because I don't honestly, and this is, I'm a little ashamed of myself that I know more and more about what I feed my little guy, because he's sitting right next to me and he's very upset at his dad right now. He's like, "Dad, what have you been feeding me?" But I forgot the brand name.
To be fair, when we're talking from a welfare perspective, Open Farm, there's a researcher at Cardiff University who did the most work looking at this brand and their claims. They work with the Better Chicken Commitment, and again, they have pictures on their website of a chicken running on farm or on grass that says, "I love to be free." That's the marketing. But of course, if you look at the Better Chicken Commitment, there's no requirement for chickens to be outside.
Outside, yeah. Wow.
So it's false advertising.
Yeah, it is.
But but if you're going to do the level of least cruel, Open Farm is one of the, I don't want to say better, but less terrible, because so much of the companion animal food industry, it's all connected to factory farming. I remember talking to someone with Cult Foods. They make cultivated pet foods, cell-based pet foods for cats and dogs. And
what a name, Cult Foods.
CULT for cultivated.
Okay. Yeah. But
And also they make nutritional yeast-based foods too, which is very cool.
uh-huh.
And he told me that the pet food industry and the animal agriculture industry, it's like a stool, and once you take a foot or a leg away, it all falls. And when we
Yeah.
learned about it, is that that the industrial animal agriculture needs the pet food industry to take away the parts that they can't use, so that it doesn't cost them to dump these things as a biohazard. If meat companies had to dump the stuff that they can't use, the things that become, rendering and all of that, it would cost so much more. So the pet food industry props up the meat industry, which a lot of animal lovers I don't think realize.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I remember looking at a comparison between the amount of meat that's being sold for pet food and the amount of meat that's being sold for human
I think
consumption.
it's around 30%
Yeah.
of meat that is
It's
produced by factory farming goes
for
to
quote
pet.
unquote pet food.
Yeah,
That's a shockingly high percentage. But it's because we have so many companions. I mean, like in the United States, I think there's well over 100 million dogs, and there isn't even a good estimate. It could be hundreds of millions, and even more cats.
yep.
Um, yeah, and when you look at kind of the stuff we sell, of the stuff that these companies sell for pet food, it's just terrifying. Like anytime you see byproduct on one of these labels, if you're buying, you know, animal-based cat or dog food, which I don't want to get into the entire debate about vegan cats because I've just had a debate
Don't
about that
talk
and it went
about
very
it.
badly. I had someone on the show and I got called a scumbag and a hypocrite because, and not even because my cats aren't vegan. My cats have been vegan, but because I gave my cat prescription cat food for a
Yep.
short period of time when he was
I,
dying. And
I, I just always say I'm really excited for cultivated cat food. That's what
absolutely,
I'm
yeah.
excited
So
for. Yeah.
let's not go down that shit show
So
because we're gonna hate each other by the end,
yeah,
and we'll be clawing each other's eyes out by the end for sure. I mean, no, I'm kidding. I
we
won't.
will agree.
For the record, if you feed your cats animals, some people are going to hate me for saying this. I don't judge, like
Just keep
because
your cat
cats,
alive and healthy. Let's just leave it at
exactly.
that.
I mean, because
Yeah.
cats, I do think they probably are obligate carnivores, and I do think there's a way to make vegan cat food. I mean, my cats have been vegan for the record, so I'm fully supportive of vegan cats. But I also understand people who, this is your family member, this is one you love, and you should love more than anyone else, and it's hard sometimes. So let's just move
Vegan
away from
dog
that shit
food is
show.
easier. Vegan dog food is easier.
Vegan dogs so much easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Vegan
love
dogs
plant-based.
are absolutely omnivores, and you can buy vegan dog food like Petco. Do you have Petco in Canada?
Oh, yeah, we
Petco?
do. Yeah, but I just get mine from a similar type of place. Yeah.
Yeah. For the record, don't buy from Petco. It's much better to buy, from Linda Middlesworth and get VDog, one of these vegan companies. But my dog, for whatever reason, he's super picky, and he doesn't even. Anyways, I need to start making rationalizations for why I'm supporting companies like Open Farm instead of VDog
There
because
you
I really
go.
should
Yeah.
be.
Look for
All
the
right,
people who sent you
I
the Dirty
I'm
live.
going to commit today to trying again with VDog. But one thing, okay, so I really do want to get back to Humane Washington.
Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking recently that's kind of interesting is I don't remember who challenged me on this. Oh, I know who it was. I won't say who it is because I don't want to call them out. But someone recently called me out or called me in because they were just confronting me personally for buying dog and cat food at all, saying, "Would you do that for your human children? Like, why are you
Oh,
buying
making
this
them
shitty ass?
kibble.
I mean, it's vegan dog. You should just make them food." And I
There,
will say,
there's been warnings against that, though. There are people who
I
have fed
know.
their pets homemade food, and it's gone really terribly.
Yeah, and actually, my good friend Kirsten Rosenberg, who's an amazing veterinarian who's testified to, she's actually said the same thing because you want to make sure the nutritional requirements are being met,
Yeah.
and it's kind of hard to do because dogs and cats have such different nutritional requirements than a human child. So everything you learn about feeding yourself doesn't
Right.
necessarily apply to a dog.
But don't you
But I
love?
have been mixing it up.
I love supplementing, throwing in, the
Yeah,
sweet potatoes and the blueberries and all
absolutely.
the kale.
No.
Yeah.
So I will say, in my defense, uh, after my dog tried my food, he quickly went back to the commercial food. That's how bad my cooking is.
There you go.
I thought I
Tried.
spent so much time making this wonderful feast, like mixing in broccoli and olive oil and nutritional yeast. And my dog takes one sniff at it and says, "I'm not eating any of this. Give me
No,
the
they
can."
want kibble. They want
I
kibble.
want kibble. I want the can. I'm done with your shitty food, Dad.
Well, but you know
So,
what? There's an interesting point there about the fact that if you've seen this trend in dog food in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, where it's all been about increasing the protein and
mhm.
so much about bringing in, like like
Yeah.
no grains and
Yeah. All
pure
meat.
milk and pure salmon and all these things,
Mhm.
that's actually been somewhat detrimental. I've heard just
Oh, absolutely.
anecdotally to dogs who are not used to eating that way.
Yeah.
That it can lead to kidney issues and things like this. They are omnivores that have been
Mhm.
raised on sort of for a long time, generationally kind of crappy dog food, and they've really
Yep.
adapted to eating
Yeah.
carbs. So
No, I mean, 10,000 years of genetic,
there you go.
manipulation will do that. And we have genetically manipulated wolves. I mean, dogs are basically genetically manipulated wolves. We didn't have as fancy genetic technology 10,000 years ago, but
Just took
it was
longer.
genetic technology is using selective breeding to pick
Selective
out,
breeding, just like we
yeah,
do
the
with
dogs that
humans.
survived and thrived, the human beings. Actually, one other point I want to make about pet food, and then we should jump back to humane
Yeah.
washing. And I still want to ask you about families and like raising
Yep.
a vegan kid, because I think that's a fascinating question too. Um, so most people don't know that there have been already in the United States over the last 50 to 100 years, massive changes in the meat industry and in consumption of meat. Because if you look 75 years ago, actually, I don't know if do you know what the dominant meat product was like 75 years ago in the United States?
Wasn't chicken.
It wasn't chicken, but it wasn't beef or pork
Pork.
either.
What was it?
Mutton.
Oh,
And you
yeah,
know why?
Europeans.
Yeah. So and the reason everybody was eating mutton in the United States, so like in the pre-World War II period, basically, everybody was eating mutton. It was like in I don't even know if they had grocery stores back then, but it was everywhere people were eating meat, they're all eating mutton. And a huge part of the reason for that, and this is how it relates to the pet food stuff, is because the mutton industry had a supportive secondary use for killing all these
Mm,
sheep, which was wool.
there
Before
you
we
go.
had all these synthetic textiles, almost all clothing, or
That
at
makes
least a
sense.
huge portion of clothing, was wool. And once polyester was invented and no one wanted to use wool anymore, and wool is very, I mean,
Ah,
there's not much wool clothing. Basically, it's what you were saying. There was basically one of the legs of the
yep,
stool of
yep,
the mutton industry
exactly.
got undercut, and basically no one was able to sell or buy mutton anymore because
That
it
makes
was no
sense.
longer affordable. And that teaches us two things. One is the point you made, and that your friend in the pet food industry made, which is, look, if we can undercut some of the stools of the meat industry, we can just phase these products out indirectly.
Waffles. Yep.
But the second thing it shows is that whenever people say like, oh, people never give up their bacon or their chicken or whatever it is they say, we'll never give this up. It's like, nah. People have already given it up. There have been huge systemic forces that have completely reshaped the American diet for hundreds of years. Even the amount of meat we eat today compared to 100 years ago or 75 years ago, it's astronomically higher because these factory farms have bred so much sheep meat in these massively obese, oversized, hormonally pumped up animals that are, in the case of a chicken, like 3 times the size of what they used to be at the same age. Like a 6-week-old chicken 75 years ago was like a little baby. And now
Yep.
they're these massive, I mean, they're beautiful and gentle creatures, and I still love them, even though they're obese. That's a horrible thing to say. I love them, period. It doesn't matter how much they weigh. But they are genetic freaks.
And they're
They're
suffering.
massively larger, and it causes immense
Yeah.
suffering to them. Immense suffering to them, and indirectly to us, too, because when you have these genetically modified, and they absolutely are genetically modified, even before we had more modern technologies, we've been genetically modifying them through selective breeding
Yep.
with massive hormones, tiny little hearts and tiny little lungs to
And the
accompany these
legs.
massive breasts and massive legs and bodies. You're going to create products that are not literally just biologically not sustainable. The
Yep.
chicken is a biological organism that cannot sustain even itself,
Yep.
much less
It's
those who
kind of
feed
a
on them.
ticking time bomb. And the amount of
Yeah. So
marketing and lobbying that has gone into creating the demand for these things is so hard to watch, to
yeah, it
see how
is.
culture is being manipulated, even teaching kids in school and feeding them in school so that they're the next generation of chicken eaters.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you heard about what happened in Florida with a ban on cultivated meat.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. But, the sad thing is, that's Ron DeSantis, who most of us on the more progressive side of things, I personally think we should try to be more bipartisan. And I think it's great to have conservative allies. Sorry if anyone hates me for that, but that's my belief. And I think that's when you look at social change, including the gay rights movement, one of the huge victories of the gay rights movement was winning over conservatives. Because
Hmm.
once you win over conservatives, the world changes. It's just,
Well, look,
there's
look
no
at what I
longer.
would refer to White Coat Waste Project
Yeah,
and
they do a lot of stuff with,
it's
right-wing politicians.
yeah,
But one of the sad things, so even if you're of the position that Ron DeSantis doesn't matter because he's a scumbag Republican, you know who tweeted in support of that too? John Fetterman, a senator in Pennsylvania, who's like a liberal.
ugh,
And one of the most disturbing things about the propaganda, and this is always the propaganda. It's so funny because in the United States on issues like Gaza right now, you have both sides saying like it's all propaganda, everything you're hearing from the other side. It's like, well, that kind of balances itself out then, because if you have both sides saying the other side is spreading propaganda, we kind of hear both sides.
yeah. Well,
The
they say that
situations
about
where,
us too, though, right? They say that about vegans and about the meat lobby too. I'm called a
yeah,
propagandist all the time.
the difference is most people only hear one side, and there's bipartisan support for the meat industry's propaganda. So, for
Yeah,
example, the Dairy Pride Act. I don't know if you've heard about this act that was passed in Wisconsin. It's been proposed in many states. It's dumbest law ever. Like, seriously, like all the waste of time I've heard of in government, it literally just bans and penalizes plant-based milk companies for calling their products soy milk.
yeah,
And it's like, dude, have you heard of China? Like, we've been calling this soy milk for 2,000
exactly.
years. Like,
No,
you're going to
it's
tell us this is
hot
not
dog
some new
debate over
thing.
and over again. Yeah, it's the
And
same about calling things burgers. Like, give me a
yeah,
break.
but it's ridiculous. But you know who the two sponsors of this bill were at the federal level? This was initially I think it was passed at the state level in Wisconsin, and then it went to the federal level, and thankfully it got killed. But you know who the two sponsors were? Elizabeth Warren
Oh,
and Tammy Baldwin.
oh, that's
Elizabeth Warren, who's a progressive and a
yeah,
really smart woman. I supported her. I voted for her in the primary in 2020. And just the thoughtlessness with which even extremely intelligent
yeah.
people
Wasn't it
support
like
this propaganda.
isn't it like AOC like having photo ops eating ice cream? Like, come on.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And AOC, I mean, she's been brave on a lot of issues, and she made a statement in support of the protesters recently that I thought was really brave because I have my misgivings about a lot of the student protesters, but I do think they're badass. I mean, I just think anyone who's risking their freedom to defend other vulnerable beings. I don't know if you agree with this, but I think these protesters should be supported, and I love them. I love them so much, and I just feel my soul singing when I see these young people risking their freedom to help vulnerable beings, whether it's human or non-human. But AOC was brave enough in a political climate in the United States where even Democrats, you get railroaded if you support the Palestinian cause. But when it comes to animal rights, when it came out that she had in a document conversations about cow farts, like everyone was making fun of her for talking about cow farts and the Green New Deal, and she immediately backtracked and said oh no, that was like an erroneous document, we don't release it. It's like,
Oh,
no, but cow farts actually are a thing. It's actually not the farts, it's more their burping.
burping.
But it actually is. Even if you didn't care about the animals, this is actually a real thing that
Yeah,
like every scientist, and there's increasingly consensus among climate scientists that agriculture, in particular livestock, is probably about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock specifically is probably minimum 14% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we cannot maintain, like there was an article, I think in Science Magazine that came out from Oxford University a couple of years ago saying we will not be able to hit our climate targets even if we got rid of every fossil fuel on the planet today. If we were perfect, we will not be able to maintain like the 1.5 degree Celsius targets, which are relatively conservative targets, unless we change our food system. We just can't do it. It's impossible to stop the climate crisis without, and even AOC
and
was scared to talk about it. She was
but
scared.
they know, and then you think about these photo ops where they're eating ice cream, and you think, did they make that connection? Because I'm immediately thinking, how is someone that smart promoting something so harmful?
Yeah.
But I don't think they even think about it, and
No.
that's a problem. That's where we have to come in and make sure, like, they second guess that they're going to go eat ice cream in public.
And that is the propaganda that's most dangerous. It's a propaganda that no one even thinks about, because that's when you know the propaganda is working. And oh man. So, and part of that is humane washing, and part of that is the media. I know Jane Velez Mitchell has called it the media.
I think so much of why humane washing works is because people wanted to, right? You're just telling them what they want to hear. I was one of those people too, where if you told, I remember for so long eating only organic meat and never pigs, because I gave up eating pork way longer before, because for some reason I thought, pigs, they knew they were dying, so I couldn't eat them, but that cows were stupid somehow. But I'd only eat organic because they had higher welfare standards and somehow they were slaughtered more nicely. I remember writing an article for Vice many years ago about humane slaughter and a slaughterhouse in Canada that would play special classical music to calm the cows down. It was like a horror movie, but at the time, I was buying it. I was buying it so much, literally and physically, buying it because I wanted to. And there were restaurants I was living in Montreal at the time, and there were restaurants that were advertising that they were sourcing their meat from this farm that used this slaughterhouse, and people wanted the humanely slaughtered steak.
Wow.
And I thought, holy shit. And this was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and now we have these labels that are telling people who now know more than they did 10 years ago about animal agriculture. And that's why these labels have to exist, is because people like you, people like me, organizations that we work with are putting out in the media reality checks about how horrible these places are. And so people are like, oh no, now I feel a little bit bad. But wait, here's a label that makes me feel better. Oh, my pork isn't the pork that I saw Wayne talking about. My pork is different. I will pay this extra $2 and I will feel better about it. Yeah. And the placating is so powerful that humane washing it's a home run for the meat industry, unfortunately.
So what do you think we do about it? I mean, obviously, one of the things we could do about it is write articles like what you wrote in Vox, which I forget the title of the article. What's the title again, if people are trying to find it? If you just search humane washing in Vox, it comes up.
Yeah, I think it comes up. I don't think it's been talked about a whole lot.
It's the humane washing of America's meat and dairy explained.
Yeah,
it's one of the explainers, because that's what Vox is famous for, like these explainer articles.
That's right.
And like I said, if you've never heard the term humane washing, or you have heard it and you just want to understand it more, just go read the article now and share it out. But I mean, when you've been trying to convince editors, other journalists, or even just people in your life that humane washing is a real thing, they have to think about it. What have you found to be most effective in getting people to pay some attention to this outright fraud that's happening in our food system?
Investigations have been extremely helpful. So, for example, like I just talked about this egg farm investigation in Canada, where this brand, Animal Justice, went into different farms in different regions of the country, and found what this nest looked like. And I remember trying to help with getting more media coverage, and I said, focus on the lie. Focus on this nest because it sounds so nice, and I guarantee you people were buying these eggs because of that. And focus on the lie and how people were being duped. And once you have that coverage and that visual of what that nest really looked like, it's going to piss people off. And I think once we came to this fact with the proof and the evidence that, say, free-range farms are actually just massive sheds where birds are being shoved all together instead of living in cages, that once they come up with these new terms and these new kind of bullshit standards, they get to fly under the radar for a little while, even a couple of years, until animal organizations, media get a hold of the truth. And then that gets exposed. And so I like to think that even things like free range and free run are starting to lose their appeal because they've been, for one thing, overused and they've been debunked. But now we have to move on to things like regenerative. So that is the new latest thing over the last couple of years, is regeneratively raised beef. People love that term. And so, I've spent the last 2 years working really hard trying to, along with a lot of great people like Nicholas Carter and Matthew Hsiung, trying to work really hard to debunk this idea of regenerative agriculture, holistic grazing, as if it's something better. Just published a video for Sentient debunking the new Common Ground movie, the documentary follow-up to Kiss the Ground, that talks about how regenerative grazing is going to save the planet. And people want to have those feel good things. Grass-fed beef. Oh, everyone that says, oh, I only eat steak if it's grass-fed. That's a lie. You go to McDonald's and eat a burger. You might buy a grass-fed beef every once in a while, but it's not the only beef you're eating. That's very unlikely. And if everyone switched to grass-fed beef, we need like a bunch of more planets to keep up with current rates of consumption. So I just think we have to keep on these misinformation tactics and these marketing ploys, and just keep busting them open with the reality of investigations and experts who are willing to come forward and say, this is not what you think it is.
Yeah, it's this regenerative stuff. It is so bizarre to me that this has any traction at all. Because, I mean, the data is very clear that, we have basically half of the world's habitable land used by agriculture, and about 70 to 80% of that is used by livestock, primarily cows. And the idea that, let's do more of that, that's going to solve the problem. It is genuinely one of the most befuddling, disturbing.
It doesn't add up.
Almost hilarious. I mean, you almost want to laugh about it, because you look at the Amazon, virtually all of the deforestation in the Amazon. The Amazon, I think the statistic is 1/3 of the carbon carrying capacity of the entire planet Earth is from the Amazon rainforest alone. I could be off a little bit, but I think it's about 1/3. I looked at the numbers recently. And virtually all of the deforestation of the Amazon is happening because of livestock. And the notion that we just need more of that and we will solve the problem, it is like worse than second grade logic. This is like 3-year-old logic. And yet somehow it's gained traction. And this dude, Alan Savory, do you know this guy? Okay.
Yeah.
Alan Savory is, I almost want to apologize to snake oil salesman for calling him a snake oil salesman. There's got to be some snake oil salesman out there who's actually told the truth at some point in their lives. Alan Savory's entire career has been based on falsehood. He is the one who falsely claimed the elephants are destroying Africa, and so we just have to kill them all off. And he had no science behind this. He has no credentials. He's not a scientist at all. And yet, for some reason, he's given a TED Talk that is seen by tens of millions of people and it's entirely based on what you said at the beginning of this entire conversation, which is telling people what they want to hear.
Exactly.
And that's not what good journalism is. That's not what good science is.
It's a fairy tale. It feels good. It feels good.
So stupid. So I'm so glad you're in this regenerative stuff.
Yeah.
But by the way,
this latest movie is the biggest problem. This Common Ground film is because you have Woody Harrelson, Jason Momoa, all of these celebrities saying this is how we save humanity is in the soil, but no one's talking about the massive reduction we would need to make regenerative agriculture even exist.
Wait, Woody Harrelson?
Well, yeah. Again, so Woody Harrelson.
He's vegan though.
I know.
Why do you support this goddamn documentary?
So the Kiss the Ground documentary came out a few years ago, and it was the first foray into making regenerative agriculture really mainstream. And he narrated the whole documentary, Kiss the Ground. And so now is the follow-up, Common Ground, which includes him as well as these other celebrities. And they really bash plant-based meats. They actually say that plant-based meats are as bad as factory farm meat in the documentary,
which is absolutely preposterous.
Because of the monocropping and the need for all of this industrial agriculture. They show the pink sludge. They're using the pink sludge against us. We invented the pink sludge.
And also the science on this is so clear. So
it is.
I've written about this. PNAS, which is one of the top 3 scientific journals in the United States, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, just did, I think they published in 2022, I believe it was, an exhaustive review of both animal-based foods and plant-based foods. I think it was the first study that just did a comprehensive analysis of consumer products, because a lot of times it's all supply side, it's not consumption side. And looking at the supply side is important, but looking at the consumption side is important too, because then you get the full life cycle, everything from transit to packaging, everything. And they found in this study, and you can go find it, I wrote a newsletter about this called Plant-Based Food is the Future. Because for the record, I actually used to be a little bit of a skeptic of the environmental claims about plant-based foods. And I could tell you why I was a skeptic for a long time. Partly because I love Cowspiracy, I love Kip and Keegan. I do think it's in the style of a documentary. And there's always like a little bit of exaggeration. I feel like in
Yeah.
advocacy, and I
Yeah.
felt okay. I'm sorry for anyone who loved that movie. I felt like,
Where I talk about that,
yeah,
the medium is the message, right? We can't
yeah,
escape the medium, like that.
yeah, and like
Twins
the
documentary.
51% figure I think is almost certainly incorrect. 50, there's a number that was thrown on by animal rights activists. 51% of all greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture. I
Yes, I
think that's
remember.
not correct. I think it's probably not good for us to say that because we lose
Yeah,
our credibility.
I
Although
agree.
I do think, there's different mediums. Like an entertaining documentary is not the same as like an opinion piece in the Globe
Yeah.
or Mail, and you have to be a lot more careful than they do, right? So
Working within the
but
medium documentary is tricky, but you don't want what I call the vegan documentary curse.
yeah, wait, what's that? Tell me more.
Well, when I was writing about for Sentient, the twin documentary, and you
Mm.
worry about documentaries getting the vegan curse, where they're just immediately debunked by mainstream audiences once it's
Yeah.
been deemed a vegan documentary, because the twin
Yep.
study was so profound on its own, but then they couched in all of this extra animal
Yep.
rights stuff that then
And
it
then
just
it's
put in that category.
yeah. No, I definitely felt the same way about Changemakers.
Yeah,
Again, people made it are amazing people. It's an excellent documentary. I
it
encourage people
is.
to watch it. But I did not think, and I love James Wilkes, are not Changemakers, game changers. I'm showing my ignorance of the vegan documentary scene. But I did see Christspiracy though, so I've seen some recent
I think
documentaries.
there's a new Game Changers coming out. I think there's something in
Okay.
the works for part
But
2.
I thought, and I know this is controversial, I thought James Wilkes' appearance on Joe Rogan was not the best for the animal rights movement, personally. And again, not because I don't think he's a compelling person. He's an amazing human being who's done so much. But I do think, I mean, this is a guy, an MMA fighter, who's trying to argue about science. And I just think we should have had a scientist arguing about science. Sometimes it matters who's the messenger and who's delivering the message. But
and the medium too. The whole bro debate thing, like Joey.
Yeah, that's just not
going and talking to that macho guy, Tate or whatever. Like I thought,
Andrew Tate?
Yeah, or was it his brother? I can't remember. I get them mixed up. But yeah, like I feel like you're set up for failure. I'm always glad when people are willing to go do it. Yeah. Tristan Tate was his name, I think, maybe the brother. I can't remember who it was, but I feel like you're doomed to fail, and you're under such a microscope. I don't know what the point is, although I'm glad they happen.
Yeah, no, I am too. But this is a long way of making the point I was trying to make, which is very different from what I'm suggesting, which is I'm actually very convinced now. As of the last 3 years, I think the evidence has become so overwhelming, not just that plant-based foods are better. And what I didn't even explain what the finding of the PNAS study was. The finding of the PNAS study was basically that the highest in impact plant-based foods, the worst plant-based diets that we can imagine, were better than the worst animal-based diets. Yep. And there's a basic thermodynamic reality to the situation, which is that most of the plant-based foods we make go to feeding farm animals. Yep. The estimates vary, but it's probably somewhere around 80% of all of the plant-based foods that could be fed to human beings are being fed to farm animals. And so when you have that basic thermodynamic inefficiency, and it varies depending on the animal products. So like chickens are the best, and the ratio is 8-1. And this has been known for a long time. I mean, David Pimentel at Cornell wrote the book on this, like food system impacts, like 30 years ago. Yep. But chicken's the best at 8-1, but cows are terrible, like 30-1. So they're all terrible. So even the best animal-based foods are awful for you. So I think the environmental argument has gotten much, much stronger over the last few years. And I think it's important. So the one thing I'll say about that, though, is that I think, while I believe in tempered radicalism, I think sometimes we have to get our foot in the door. I also think at the end of the day, you get your foot in the door for a reason, which is you still have to make that strong animal rights messaging. Yeah, like by all means, tailor it to the audience. But, and this is another thing that I found lacking in so much of the media that you do so well. So for example, the piece you did about Jenny McQueen's piece was so powerful because it did tie in some of the ag-gag, the government repression, corruption stuff, but it tied it in without hiding the ball, which is fundamentally, this is about a transformation in the system. This is about the notion that animals should be treated like individuals who deserve to be rescued, not just things. So it's not just about, oh, she found particularly cruel conditions. So many of the journalists who've worked with us, even on opinion pieces, even like Nick Kristof at the New York Times. I mean, he did this great piece on suffocating pigs to death, and like the horrible CO2 gas chambers that Smithfield uses in California.
I wrote a piece right after is too about the same thing.
And he didn't take it to the next step or even really ask the question, which is, should we use the example at all? Like,
Right.
why are we trying to figure out, is it better to gas them or slit their throats or electrocute them instead of saying, look, there's something, and I will say Christoph is better than most of the opinion journalists because he has sort of gone in that direction, but most journalists are just terrified to take that next step. So can you tell me about like how you managed to take that next step and point out the broader systemic concern and the fundamental transformation that we should be thinking about in your journalism when so many other journalists have not been able to do that?
I often, when I'm giving workshops for others to do the same thing, as I say, when we're writing about this, we don't need to use over expressive or emotive language. The reality is bad enough.
Bad enough. Yeah.
And so when we talk about it in facts, when I think readers may be expecting you, like I said, to be crazy instead of clever, just speak about it as it is. It's bad enough. And once you go down that path to talk about how bad it is, talking then about the fundamentals of commodifying animals becomes easier. You take the reader down that path of reality without turning them off with overdoing it. Then you can have that chance to talk about, to question the system as a whole. And it's become increasingly easier since the pandemic as well to talk about the system as a massive failure. And that it's not just this case, it's not just these animals, it's that the food system as a whole is unsustainable, which means it's failing and it's going to ultimately fail, and that concerns everyone. We should all be concerned about that.
Yeah, that is such good advice. And that's not just good advice for journalism. I mean, that's just good advice for advocacy.
Yeah.
I do think there's a place for more kind of emotionally charged propagandistic language. Like when you're talking to our own audience, sometimes using the supercharged emotional language is great because you're mobilizing people.
Tactics, different audiences.
Yeah. But for persuasion purposes, show, don't tell. And I remember two examples. One is just a piece of advice. My good friend Lauren, who's been doing press stuff for many years for a lot of civil rights organizations and now is doing a little more animal stuff. She once gave me a piece of advice that I thought was so good, which is stop using so many goddamn adverbs. When you say
exactly,
like,
cut them out.
Cut them out because the adverbs are the problem. Whenever you say like, the brutally torturous conditions, it's like,
right.
Why do you have to say brutally torturous? Just describe what the conditions are.
Right.
But the other thing is, I remember the first version of the press releases that Direct Action ever was releasing after and I deserve no credit for these investigations because I was like long gone. I was still helping out, but I got tired of running the show in 2019. And so it was people like Elmira Tanner and Matt Johnson who did this incredible investigation of what's called ventilation shutdown during COVID-19. When they shut down all the slaughterhouses, the farms basically didn't want to feed their animals, didn't know what to do with them. And they're literally just growing too big to fit in the farms. So they just shut down all the vents, pumped in hot steam, and essentially scalded these animals alive. They boiled these animals alive. And I remember the first version of the press release that I got sent was like, outrageous, brutal torture of animals unfolding in Iowa. And I was like, don't use all those propagandistic terms. Just tell people factually what's happening.
It's bad enough.
Yeah, exactly. Just say they're closing the vents, pumping in hot steam, and thousands of animals are screaming after they die from heat exhaustion.
That's it.
That is enough. And that cannot be challenged in any way because that's just factually exactly what was happening in Iowa. And so they changed the press release and it made just national weight, partly because it was undeniable. It was absolutely undeniable that these are just the facts. And it was also undeniable when you actually paid attention to the facts. And, if you use all these adverbs and propagandistic language, it often...
You'll just be dismissed. You'll just be dismissed.
Say like, well, I don't believe anything because you're using such wild language.
Yeah, you can't be trusted. You're not credible.
Exactly. So it's, I think that the shift in framing towards just more factual language actually is really important because the factual language itself was incredibly outrageous. You didn't have to say the conduct was outrageous. Just describe what happens.
That's right. That's right.
And that's one of the lessons you learn in just basic writing, show, don't tell. To the extent you can, don't tell people what to think. Don't tell people how they should react. Just show them what's happening. And if the reaction is a legitimate reaction, they will react just from you showing them the truth.
I think it's particularly important in this space because the expectation is that you're going to overdo it and that you're going to exaggerate or lie. And if you just stick to the facts, your credibility is more intact, and that's so important for people like us.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, any final thoughts on humane washing you want to share from your piece in Vox that you think people don't know about, that you think would be kind of interesting or fascinating for people to learn about humane washing?
I think I wrote that, I believe, 2 years ago. I think just keep an eye out for the evolution, like I said, to see, which kind of labels and terms sort of go out of fashion and the new ones that come along. Also, interestingly, last year, or was it this year? Last year, I also took the term to another spot beyond humane washing, now to talk about conservation washing. So I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail about conservation watching, which is a new tactic being used by zoos and aquariums. So we see these multifacets of placating the public to feel good about exploiting animals in a variety of ways. So the piece is about zoos and aquariums now positioning themselves in marketing and in the public sphere as doing good, as saving species, as being conservationists, and how it's just not true. There was a zoo here in Canada that I think was, saving a number of butterflies, and that was literally the only thing that they were doing to call themselves working in conservation, where they may have saved some butterflies, which is great, but that's nothing compared to the amount of tigers and lions and elephants and things that are being held in captivity. One doesn't somehow negate the other. So yeah, just keep an eye out for how these different washing techniques are used in every aspect of animal exploitation.
Yeah, and the conservation crisis is another one that I think we talk about tempered radicalism and arguments to get in kind of the debate. I feel like extinction and conservation is one of those things that most people, because like the polar bears, I mean, everybody, you watch these haunting images of polar bears starving to death or, swimming for miles and all the sea ice has disappeared and they just starved to death. They literally just starved to death or drowned in the water. And I mean, I don't think we talk enough about, we're going through the sixth mass extinction in this planet's history.
People don't believe it. I don't think people believe it.
There have only been 5 other episodes where many species, as are currently going extinct, have gone extinct in the past. And the other thing that people don't realize about that is this is, by most measures, the worst of them all. Like, this is worse than the asteroid hitting the planet Earth and decimating our entire planet. That is the equivalent of what's happening now, because most of these prior extinctions, like even when the asteroid hit the Earth, this is like a period of 1 million years where all these species go extinct. Dinosaurs lived for a long time after the asteroid hit the Earth. It wasn't like an immediate cataclysm. What we're doing right now to the planet is a cataclysm. The rate of species loss.
Terrifying.
And I've actually done research in this, so I'm not just talking on my ass. Like I've published research on this. It is faster than any extinction period in the planet's history. And the number one cause of that, 100%, and this is, again, like I don't think I'm exaggerating when I'm saying this. I think the science on this is very solid, is animal agriculture. It's livestock. It's deforestation. It's the fact we're encroaching on every habitat. This is
biodiversity losses.
It's driven by livestock. It is not an invalid approximation of the problem to say that everywhere human beings come in contact with non-human animals across the planet Earth, they flee, they're exterminated, or they're enslaved. Those are their 3 options. They flee, and there's not much land left. When half of the planet's habitable land is already being taken by agriculture, a lot of the land is already gone. They either run away from us, and there's not much habitat left. They're exterminated, in which case they're gone from the planet Earth forever.
Wolves and coyotes.
Or they're enslaved. Yeah, it's terrifying.
Wolves and coyotes being treated like they have
one of the scariest charts, I don't know if you've ever seen in one of these biomass charts of the planet Earth. Like, they're so scary.
The wild animals.
No. Yeah, it's so scary. Because you just look at, it's funny because everyone talks about like replacement theory and the conspiracy theory on the right that, the left is trying to replace all the white people on this planet. There actually is a legitimate replacement that's happening.
Yeah, no kidding.
Earth. And that is factually substantiated by an enormous amount of research.
Happening
and
right
that is
now.
the replacement. It is the replacement of every wild animal on the planet Earth with an animal in a cage or a human being.
That is so true. That is so true.
The charts are shocking. It's like you look at the biomass, which is just the weight of all the animals on the planet Earth.
This.
Yeah, it used to be like, okay, human beings and livestock they're significant, but they don't dominate the planet Earth. And now it's like everything is being replaced by livestock. So
what's the stat about that? There's more chickens on Earth than humans. Is that something I've heard before?
That is true, and there are more chickens than like every other bird on the face of the planet combined.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's for sure.
that one of the lines, like, speaking of compelling journalists, like another one of the few journalists I felt like has been able to inch forward on animal rights is Andy Greenberg at Wired. I don't know if you ever talked to him. He would
Yeah,
love you. You two
yeah,
should talk to him
we
now.
should.
He's amazing. But he had a line that I thought, like, I just read it and it just shook me to my core. And the line, it's in his Wired piece when he worked with us in the Smithfield investigation. His line was, the average lived experience of a living being on this planet is the life of a factory farm animal in a cage.
Wow.
And it was just like haunting and terrifying
But it's true.
At least for land animals,
Yes.
the average mammalian or avian animal on this planet, their experience is to be trapped in a cage of flesh or a cage of wire. I mean, broiler chickens technically are not in wire cages, but when you're given less than 1 square foot of space for your entire life, that is still a cage. You don't have anywhere to go. So yeah,
we need to talk about something positive.
Well, let's talk about something. Let's talk about why vegans should have families.
Because
okay. So tell me the argument. I mean, actually, was this even something you thought about, or was it something you just did? And it was like, all right.
It's something I've written about, is being a vegan parent to a vegan child, and I've written about it. Sort of the trials and tribulations, but also how amazing it is to see. A small human being that you get to shape and form, and how natural it becomes for her to be vegan.
Exactly.
Yes.
I do not understand the people who say, like, how are you going to make sure your kid's vegan? I'm like,
no, she just is
bro,
vegan.
Have you talked to a kid before? Yeah, I know. Kids love animals so much.
Exactly.
And this is the future. Like when you interact. Yeah,
she's a little activist. Her existence in the world is activism. So
tell me, did you because a lot of people are just deciding not to have kids at all because, I mean, they think the world's in a terrible place. Climate change is destroying everything. We can't. So what did you strategically and ethically think about this before you had a kid, or was it just like,
no, it happened. So when she was 6 months old, when you transitioned to solid food.
That's right. You told me that she helped you go vegan. Okay. Yeah.
So
all right.
it
tell me about
happened right at 6 months old. So it happened while I was pregnant, and then while she was an infant. You really start as a new parent. You really start to think about your values and what you want to instill in this tiny human being that is now relying on you for everything, and who they are, initially going to become. It seemed like this massive responsibility. And so I had to get my values in order before I could start putting them on her. And so that was part of what led me into this journey. And it also just happened to be January. So I did Veganuary right when she was 6 months old, and I was starting her on solid food. And at the same time, I was starting to write more and more about animals and working closer with this group in Canada, Animal Justice. And it all just kind of came together. And after January, I was like, oh, well, this is the way to go. Once I learned that I could make a cream sauce out of nuts and seeds and not have to eat dairy, I was set. I was like, okay, I'm sold. So
that was your weakness, cream sauce.
That was it. I was like, how am I going to have Alfredo? And then I'm like, oh my God, now I can have Alfredo and I don't feel disgusting after. It's like a bonus.
Vegan Alfredo is so good. You can make such nut-based cheeses.
Exactly.
Like, I can kind of understand mozzarella, to be honest. Like mozzarella, it's been hard to replicate. But
there are some that are harder than others. That's true. But as soon as I realized I could make a cream sauce, I was sold.
You're sold.
And so now she is now 7, almost 8 years old. And, she's the one vegan in her class. And so there's some things that have become a little harder. I just finished writing a piece that no one seems to want to publish. So if anyone's listening to this and wants to publish a piece on some of the concessions you sort of have to make as a vegan parent, as raising a child in an omnivorous world. So I wrote for Today's Parent when she was about 2 years old. Today's Parent is a parenting magazine in Canada, about all of my plans for how I was going to raise her vegan and make sure she had vegan cupcakes in the freezer at daycare, and all the little things to make sure she could always be vegan. Some of those things don't work out in the long run, and you have to make some tiny concessions. But ultimately, she's vegan in her heart. She's a little activist. And I think having these children out in the world, we talk about being vegan everywhere in all different corners of the world. We don't need everybody to open a vegan restaurant. We need vegans everywhere, right? We need vegans in different jobs and different positions in different social circles, and kids include in that. So as a kid, she's a little vegan activist in her own right wherever she goes. And she has found a very natural way. Last year, she won the Empathy Award for her class.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'm like, that's just her natural character. she'll get mad at a kid for squishing a bug in the schoolyard because that's crazy. Why are you squishing bugs?
Yeah, why
Who
would you hurt
told you
anyone?
that? How unnatural is that? It shocks her that anyone would do that. Where did that idea even come from? To her, it's so illogical. And so I think having watching a child be vegan is so cool. And
Yeah.
I do think, you need to have them out there helping to spread compassion to the next generation. I
Yeah.
can't to these little kids. She can.
Yeah. So what do you say to people who say, I guess, I mean, there are two arguments that I've heard against having children by very close friends of mine. Again, and I'm sorry, they're probably going to be listening to this and just cringing and, shaking their head and their fists at the screen. I'm sorry. I guess I can't even say I'm sorry to Alexandra because I'll get arrested if I tell her I'm sorry. So I didn't say it for the
Yeah.
record. I didn't say anything to Alexandra Paul, but when I can imagine them saying, and because I know this because they've told me this. Not that I've had any kids. I don't, I have no kids, and I don't have a very good plan for having kids, even though I kind of like the idea. But it's hard to have kids when you're in jail. So that's been a little difficult. But so one of the arguments they make, well, the more common argument is just, don't you realize humans are contributing so much damage to the planet?
Yep.
How do you respond to that argument?
There's no ethical consumption under capitalism, right? And so I just finished making a video for Sentient about the crop death argument and talking, that stupid argument where people talk about we kill more animals because of harvesting. And ultimately, we have to recognize we are causing damage all the time. I think we need to just do our best to cause the least amount of damage. And, a plant-based diet is a part of that. Shopping secondhand is a part of that. Raising a child plant-based is a part of that. So I think the fact, like you had suggested before, that I only had one kid instead of two, that you're actually, depleting it more. But I do have fears. I have fears about her future on this planet and the future of the planet and other little children. So that's a big part of it, is the concern that you've created a new generation that may not even have anywhere to live. So that's the scary part of it. But I think we have to be realistic about the fact that humans, we're a drain on this planet, and ultimately we probably shouldn't be making a whole bunch more of us.
So the other argument that in many ways is more compelling to me, because I agree with you. I think, trying to rinky dink what someone does on the planet in the context of an industrial system that's destroying the entire earth is kind of, it just seems like it's missing the systemic origins of a lot of these problems. So I've never been particularly convinced by the idea, for the same reason I'm not convinced that saving the world happens by converting one vegan at a time. I think there are bigger systemic issues. It's not about the choices any one person makes, and that's controversial. And I wrote an article called Boycott Veganism a long time ago that got me banned from the vegan movement for a little while. Let's not even go into that, because you're going to bring back old traumas. I'm going to start crying uncontrollably from being ousted from all the vegan. I got banned from so many vegan forums, and I wrote that article, and no one even read the article, because it's not actually about boycotting veganism. That was just the title. For the record, it was just the title. I was not telling people to boycott veganism. It was just a clip. It was. I know. Such an idiot.
Failed.
But so, anyways, I've never been convinced by that argument. Honestly, I think the more convincing argument to me, and this may tell more about the psychosis that is my life than anything else, but is the notion that raising a child ethically just takes so much attention away from broader moral and community and political and social concerns that you become you have to become self-centered, in the same way that, like when I had a vegan cat and he was dying, I started feeding him animal-based foods. And that's kind of what happens when you have a child. And so how do you respond to that? Do you think there's any merit to that argument, that you basically no longer think about the community, you think about yourself and your family?
That's just human nature, survival. That's mothering. I mean, even just my time, the amount of time that I feel like I have to take away from the movement or my job because I have another human to take care of. I mean, it's definitely a part of it. I mean, these are sacrifices we make. I'd love to think that I'm at least investing in, a little vegan activist. Whether or not she continues that, we'll see. But, or just a morally lovely person who will go on to do big things, and that she will be more of a positive contributor to the world than a drain. So you just hope that you're building something positive rather than something negative.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that argument does concern me because I mean, I've loved all the non-humans in my life, and I'm very grateful to have Oliver and Joan and all of my little ones. And caring for them has been just one of the greatest joys of my life. And the hardest thing about being in jail for sure has been separating from them.
Yeah.
Like it's so hard. And I'm very lucky because I have great family members and exes who care for my animals when I'm incarcerated. But it's still very hard. And a human being obviously is like
Well, and I have
even if you
both. I got
treat
a bunch of dogs and humans,
yeah
so
so
yeah, it takes time.
yeah, no, it's a lot of work. But a human being, I think, by all accounts, I've never raised a human child, but it seems like it's a bigger investment of time and effort than a
It's a
dog.
lot of work. Yeah.
It's a lot of work. But the way I maybe rationalize the ethics of having children as a vegan are, I think there are three primary arguments that I have, and I don't know if you believe in any of these. The first is that I think there's something about raising human and non-human children that just expands your empathy in very important ways.
Absolutely.
That
Oh, yeah.
because a lot of people say it's selfish to have kids, or but when another living being is completely dependent on you, and you are in many ways you become dependent on them in a lot of ways. I mean, that kind of sounds like a horrible relationship, actually, like a
But
very
it's
toxic, mutually dependent relationship.
very selfish people, two very selfish beings relying on each other. It's very true, but that's human
No, yeah,
nature.
it does expand your empathy in important ways, and I think I've just seen with my non-human animals, and even with my nieces, I have a different connection to animal rights in fighting for the future when there
Yep.
is a specific individual I'm fighting for. I
Yep.
wake up every morning, I look
Oh,
Oliver
yep.
in the eye. Oliver's my dog, and this movement becomes personal. And
Absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
so. I think there's an argument that activists who take on that role of caring for another human being, they have a stake in the future and just a
Yep.
personal connection to the future and
Absolutely.
an expansion in their conception of what they need to do to make the world a better place
It's more
in a way
urgency.
that, yeah. So that's one thing. Second thing I really believe in. So that's one argument. Argument one is expands your conception of both compassion and your responsibility to the future. Second argument is I'm just convinced that most kids, if you raise them properly, are just not even vegan. They're like dynamite anti-speciesists. Like, because
Yeah.
the kids I've met who've been raised vegan from day one and like with an anti-speciesist framework are so powerful in
Yeah, they
ways that I
really
can
are.
hardly imagine. I have a friend who's a professor of law, who's raising her kid in a pretty. There's not a big vegan community around this child. I mean, there's some, but not a huge one. And this kid is like 7 years old and is already a more eloquent and powerful activist than me. And I've just seen that over and over again. You have to raise your kids correctly. It can't just be they're vegan, because being vegan alone is not enough. You actually have to teach them good values. And that's hard. I'm not saying that's guaranteed to happen. But the success rate I've seen among genuinely anti-speciesist parents is
Yep.
astronomically high. And so I think if we are going to create a future that is vegan, that supports animal rights, somebody actually has to teach these kids.
Yep.
But the third point that in many ways is the most important point for me, because it's a systemic point, is one of the things that Erica Chenoweth told me when I first talked to her. Erica Chenoweth is a professor of political science at Harvard University, and she wrote this book about direct action. So if there's anyone who knows more about direct action and sacrifice and why people have to be willing to sacrifice for social change, this is literally the woman who wrote the book on the subject.
Yeah.
She wrote the book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And one of the things she told me that was most fascinating was effective movements show their communities and they represent the community. And you cannot represent the community at large if you do not have grandkids and grandparents.
True.
Because real communities have kids. By definition, if a community does not have kids, it goes extinct.
That's right.
And if we do not show the world that we can have vegan kids, that there is a possible future that involves the continuation of the human species
Right.
in an ethically sustainable way that doesn't involve violence against animals, we will not change the world.
That's a great point.
If we're a bunch of if we're just a bunch of old hipsters smoking weed all day and tripping in our little communes of 70-year-old people, literally by definition, we will die off and be replaced by a bunch of right-wing people who have 17 children who all kill animals.
There you go.
So sorry, Jeremy, Jeremy, our staff member who's on the chat here, just said, nothing wrong with that. That's Jeremy's future. He wants to be a bunch of old hippies smoking weed. And I'm not against that. I think it's
We need them
great that
too,
they're
but we need the kids too.
exactly. We
Too.
need children. We cannot represent the future if there's no one in the future.
That's a great
And if
point.
we don't, if there are no vegan kids and there are no vegan families, there will be no vegan future. So I, for one, again, controversially, and I know a lot of my friends, I'm going to get so many emails about this now from people who are upset about this. I, for one, applaud you for raising your kid vegan, for having a kid and trying to build that future with her. So thank you for doing that. And fuck off to all the people who criticize you. I don't know if you get criticism, and maybe I shouldn't curse at them.
I get criticism more that I'm abusing my child and that I'm brainwashing her, which I find so fascinating. People say, did you let her choose to be vegan? And I said, well, did you let your kid choose to eat dead animals? Exactly. Or is that just a given? Like I interviewed a child psychologist when I was writing the article for today's Parent Magazine about how to accommodate vegan values in, say, a neighborhood in a school where people aren't vegan. And she framed it this way, that you treat it like a family value, like you do anything else. And that your family values may be different from your neighbor's family values. And that's okay. That in our house, just like how people do with certain religious aspects or political aspects, this is just our family value. Our friend next door might not agree with it. Until a certain age, we are respectful of people's other choices. But I can imagine once my daughter turns about 11, 12, she's going to have her own opinions. And then that's the perfect time to allow her to be a little less okay with the neighbors eating chickens.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So anyways, it's interesting. So many different questions and challenges. And I will say, these are complex questions. And I'm kidding when I said, fuck off if you're going to criticize someone for having kids. Because I think, there's an intelligent conversation that can be had.
I get it. Yeah, I get it.
I just think we all need to have, and maybe I haven't modeled this very well, we all need to have a little more humility about our positions. I definitely did not model it well because I just said fuck off to everybody who disagrees with me on this. But that's not the best approach, for the record. So don't do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
But the reality is, I have very dear friends who are leaders in the anti-natalist movement. So I think I live my life in a way that aspires to really listen carefully and be humble with respect to people who criticize some of the beliefs and positions I have. And I think that's one of the paths towards all of us getting better and making a better world for all the living beings on this earth. Okay, we've been going for almost 2 hours. Any last things you wanted to talk about? Can you give us a hint at least about what you're doing with Vox?
I don't know if I'm allowed, and I haven't even written it yet.
Can you tell me who you're working with? Is it Kenny again?
No, this is Marina. Marina's my lovely editor. Yeah.
Marina's amazing.
She's
Marina's
great.
Another one of these journalists.
She is. Yep. She's fantastic.
Speaking of writing amazing stuff, she wrote one of the best pieces about the veterinary industry you could read. She's written the best pieces about the right to rescue. So our work, rescuing animals. She's done so much in transformative work.
I love working with her. I'm so excited that she commissioned me for this project. So cool. We're all.
But you can't say anything about it?
I don't know. So I can't. I don't know what I can. And also, I don't like to fix it, right? Because I haven't put pen to paper yet, so to speak. I see. So I don't want to be premature.
Oh, you're one of those, huh?
It'll be out. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm the opposite of you. I'm the anti-jinxer. I tell everyone everything I'm going to do, and then when I fail, I'm miserably ashamed afterwards.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about.
I tell people exactly what I'm going to do, but I think sometimes your approach is a better one. Okay, any other last things you want to share?
I can't imagine anything that we haven't covered yet, Wade.
We've covered a lot. Well, I'll just ask you then, just to conclude, is there any great way for people to follow your reporting and your writing? Do you suggest people follow you on social media or at Sentient Media? Where do you think is the best place to follow you?
I'm all over social media. So Twitter or X is where I probably do the most.
Do we really have to call it X now?
I don't know.
God damn it, Elon.
Twitter. Let's just call it Twitter. So I'm at Jess L. Reid, R-E-I-D, on Twitter. And then my Instagram is also public. I share so much of my vegan food and my vegan parenting, more of my personal stuff, but also my work. So that's Jess LSR on Instagram. Those are probably the two best places to get both sides of my world. I'm very active and very open, and anybody can write me. I'm always giving advice for people how to write letters to the editor. That's what I would leave people with, is that if you are an animal lover, animal activist, animal advocate, and you want to be helpful to media coverage, is always write letters to the editor whenever you see animals being talked about in the media, positively, negatively. Whenever you see my work in the media, write letters to the editor. Don't even be dissuaded if it's not published. Just know that just sending them in and having editors see that these stories matter and that these perspectives matter is so important. Don't write it on Facebook. Take that 50-word comment on Facebook and put it in an email to the editor instead.
Right on. Well, wonderful advice, and so excited to hear more about your upcoming projects. And we'll have to have you on the show again after this thing comes out in Vox, okay?
I'd love to.
Okay. All right. Until next time. Thank you, Jessica.